Hey everybody, it's Minius, and let's look at things the next Mass Effect game needs to succeed. Yes, there is a brand new Mass Effect game being worked on. Exactly how far along this game isn't known, but it is far along enough that we've gotten a teaser trailer, an announced project lead, and news of specific rehires of veteran Mass Effect developers. So this thing is happening. But the Mass Effect franchise is in a really difficult spot for a new game. The general concept behind Mass Effect Andromeda of leaving the galaxy before the arrival of the Reapers was about as good as an idea as possible given the state of the Milky Way after the end of Mass Effect 3. But that game failed to make the impact needed to move the franchise forward, and now we're headed back to the Milky Way for a complicated attempt to revitalize the franchise. So what does this new Mass Effect game need to succeed? I've come up with 12 main points that, if implemented, should give this franchise what it needs to jump back to prominence. Let's start with a story. Establish interesting mysteries and solve them in this game. Don't wait. One of the larger Andromeda complaints is that nothing was solved. That crazy space cloud you hit to open the game? We've got no idea what it is. We know the ancient race that created the ancient terraforming structures around the cluster are called the Jardin, but we don't know why they did that, or where they came from, or what even happened to them. There are a bunch of other unsolved mysteries in Mass Effect Andromeda, and I assume BioWare planned on solving them in the sequels or potential DLC, but we never got there. The result is that campaign ended up unsatisfying. In fairness to the Andromeda team, the strategy of establishing a mystery or intrigue and then stringing people along for as long as possible before getting to an actual resolution is extremely common in both video games and television. But let's look at a specific series whose opening game both established and solved huge mysteries right out of the gate, setting up that franchise for a long run. And there's a good chance you heard of the game I'm talking about. It's called Mass Effect. The ancient, vanished alien race whose supposed artifacts litter the Milky Way, we find out what happened to them, and what they did with their final breath. Those artifacts you spend so much time around, we found out exactly who made them and why they were made. That enormous spaceship that freaks everyone out in the beginning of the game, we find out exactly what it is and its purpose. These reveals help make the original Mass Effect the best story ever told in video games, and sets up a franchise that continues to this day. In order to succeed, this new Mass Effect game needs a solid story base to go from. Nail the villain. Another thing the original game did well was portray fantastic villains. Saren was both terrifyingly sinister and partially sympathetic. Villains are often overlooked in all kinds of media, but the really good stories come with fully developed antagonists, with relatable or understandable motives, and an agenda that is particularly damaging and or personal to the protagonist. For the new Mass Effect game, they need an antagonist that can do all of that, preferably with a magnetic personality.
I am assuming direct control.
Make sure there's a twist. This was probably my largest complaint about Mass Effect Andromeda. Its lack of a solid twist left the story predictable and ultimately a bit flat. Twists are also something the first game absolutely nailed. I don't mean to overemphasize what the original did, but there's good reason to. It's a great game for this new one to emulate. Virtually all those mysterious reveals I talked about earlier, the mysterious artifacts, the ancient civilizations, the motivations of the villain, came with an unexpected and major twist, which made the original Mass Effect a wild and enjoyable ride. And I suppose a twist isn't 100% necessary, but a solid paradigm-shifting event would go a long way towards making this new game successful. Separate the story from open-world exploration. By that I mean the many hubs and explorable areas along the line of Mass Effect Andromeda or the original Mass Effect. Open worlds often extend the length of a playthrough, which is why developers and publishers like them so much, but they also slow the pacing of the story way down. Which is exactly why, if it were up to me, I would sidestep them entirely in the next game. Getting stuck in an explorable area and needing to wander around just to get to the next story point slows things down way too much. Pacing in any story is super important, and in a story-heavy game like Mass Effect, it is essential. Maybe eliminating open worlds is unreasonable, it's just not gonna happen. Electronic Arts has been insisting on them, and honestly a lot of gamers like them. So my suggestion here is, make the open worlds optional. Allow the player to launch directly into a mission from their ship, and then return to the ship when that mission is over, so they can repeat the process and progress the story immediately if they so choose. This is actually something the original Mass Effect struggled with at times, but the second and third games nailed it. Their stories flowed amazingly from point to point with very few hiccups. Forcing the player to drive or walk from mission to mission just takes too long. A great open world game with a great story is a very hard thing to do. It didn't work in Mass Effect Andromeda and should be bypassed if possible. Dealing with pacing also falls into my next point. Tell a story that allows the player to take their time. Maybe my favorite part of Mass Effect 2 was the emphasis on Shepard to take his or her time. The supporting characters often just came right out and said it. We need to build up the team. We need to be stronger. And games often don't do this. The plot is usually a race to stop the villain, which most of us RPG gamers now just ignore entirely. It doesn't line up to fully dive into the universe, get to know the characters, your surroundings, and race a villain to a plot point. That formula just ends up being a way to lose immersion and should be tried less. So I suggest repeating the Mass Effect 2 formula on this. You need to build yourself up for an assault or final mission and place an emphasis on taking your time. This is also a better way to make adding explorable worlds and hubs fit with the plot of the game. Keep the Trilogy recalls to a minimum. While this new Mass Effect game appears to be a continuation of the trilogy, it also has to be the start of something new. It's not a reboot, but its plot points should be something entirely different. The ending or endings of Mass Effect 3 were very final. There's not a lot to continue. Also, more importantly, this game needs to be an entry point for new people to play the series. Mass Effect needs to grow its player base from what it is now. A story packed full of old plot points and characters is going to serve as a barrier for new players to enter. At the very least, the Reapers should be entirely avoided, and Reaper-related plot lines should be kept to a minimum. We spent 3 games on them and need something new. Engaging characters and relationships. The importance of this one is so obvious that I'm not even going to get into it here. Without great characters and relationships with those characters, a Mass Effect game cannot be successful. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The next few points are on combat, which directly impacts the most important and final point. And I'm going to head off some comments that I've seen in the past right here. Comments like, I don't care about the combat, or they should ignore the combat and just focus on RPG stuff. Mass Effect's core appeal will always be the story, characters, and RPG elements, but in order to justify the investment needed to really nail those points, the game needs to appeal to as large a player base as possible, and making a game that is really fun to play is the best way to expand that base. There is no need to just focus on the story, or RPG elements, or combat. You can do it all, and you should do it all. Fortunately, BioWare is really close to a very, very good combat system, but let's dive into some potential tweaks. Up the abilities. What sets Mass Effect's combat apart from every other shooter or space shooter is its ability system. Shooters are a dime a dozen. Games that stray away from just shooting stand out. And Mass Effect Andromeda had some really interesting ideas for pushing that gameplay forward, but some adjustments are needed. First off, being able to choose from a wider array of powers is fantastic. You had access to all of them in the campaign. Having individual cooldowns for each is also fantastic, because throwing back-to-back abilities is exhilarating. Waiting for them to recharge is not, and you simply spend too much time waiting for them to recharge in Mass Effect Andromeda. In Mass Effect 3, you could find viable builds on the highest difficulties that barely required you to shoot. You had the option to go with guns if you want, but you could also go through and barely fire your weapon. Being limited to 3 powers at once is also less than ideal. I understand the reasoning behind that decision for balancing purposes, as each ability had its own cooldown, but that really limited your options in the moment. If you want to play games with all gunplay, that's great, but the world doesn't need just another shooter. Make damage impactful. On the easy difficulties in Andromeda, you can just tear through enemies. It's a blast, but it's not hard at all. As the difficulty increases in the campaign or multiplayer, the enemies get spongy. Very spongy. I don't have a problem with the occasional beefy enemy, but upping the hit points of every enemy? If you snipe or shotgun a mid to low tier enemy on any difficulty, they should go down. If you nail a low-tier enemy with a combo explosion on any difficulty, they should go down. If you hit the shields of a mid to low-tier enemy with the right ability, those shields should break. In Mass Effect 3, all of this happened. The abilities and guns in the Mass Effect universe are crazy powerful. They should wreck people, and they would wreck people. It's fun to wreck people.
Shit, you sound like a pussy.
I'm singling Andromeda out in this video because this is a Mass Effect video. But adding tons of hit points in lieu of additional mechanics to increase difficulty is ridiculously common in video games. It's also not needed. It's more fun if it's different. So here are a couple quick suggestions for increasing game difficulty without spongy enemies. Before I go on too long about this, let's go for increased enemy AI, or additional mechanisms like forcing you to kill enemies in a certain order, or deal with enemies within a certain time limit before you're overrun. Have as many missions as possible take place in an area specifically designed for combat. I'll look specifically at Mass Effects 2 and 3. Each mission was designed for gameplay. Everything fit. You didn't need to wander around a pre-built open world. It was all combat and conversations. You shouldn't have to drive from settlement to settlement or wander around to find enemies. Stopping to chat with the occasional character is the only thing needed to break up the combat. Things should be compact and crisp whenever possible. Expand the multiplayer. I'm going to get very specific here because an expanded Mass Effect multiplayer could easily be damaging to the single-player experience, and that needs to be avoided. I'm not advocating a Mass Effect game like Anthem or Destiny, but in order to keep up with modern gaming and get the funding needed to make the necessary experience, the series needs more. They've done a bit with that in wave-based co-op modes in Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect Andromeda, but there's room for a lot more. Co-op story missions, extended difficulty raids. Crowd control abilities might hamper the quality of direct PvP, but team and score-based player versus environment competition could easily work. I'm not talking anything attached to the story. Whatever happens in the multiplayer should have no impact on anything in the single player. A player should be able to entirely ignore the multiplayer and not miss anything. I'll repeat what I said just a minute ago. In order to keep the single-player campaign as deep and as expansive as it should be, Mass Effect needs to increase its player base. Multiplayer can drive people to the single player, and single player can drive people to the multiplayer and create an inter-feedback loop that lasts for years as new content is added. An excellent example of what Mass Effect can do came out of nowhere last year with Ghost of Tsushima. A single-player game sprouted a side, multiplayer section they didn't even advertise for, which featured a wave-based co-op mode, just like Mass Effect 3 and Andromeda, but also a set of co-op story missions and, most impressively, a 4-player raid experience requiring strategy and cooperation. Something like this, set in the Mass Effect universe with ability-based gameplay, would be phenomenal. A real game changer in terms of interest level, and Mass Effect is in need of a bit of a jolt. I'll repeat something again though because it's important. This cannot replace the single player experience. This cannot interfere with the single player experience. But if done right, it will enhance the overall experience. And I spent time on this for a specific reason. Financial support and backing from Electronic Arts. The last point is also the most important. The team at BioWare needs enough time and money to make a full and complete game, and that appears to have been an issue with the studio's previous 2 titles. Asking an organization with a lot of money to spend a lot of money on something specifically for you is one of the easiest things in the world to do, because people are entitled to spend their money on what they want, and companies have a right to get the maximum return out of their investment. And one of the reasons I spent so much time on the potential multiplayer aspect of the new game is because this game needs to be appealing from a monetary standpoint, and that's something that can do it. Although the Mass Effect Andromeda budget was officially unannounced, there was a reported and disputed budget of $40 million, which if true is extremely lean for a AAA game. But let's assume that the reported $40 million budget of Mass Effect Andromeda is wrong. The majority of Andromeda was still just made in 18 months, and that's not enough time in today's world of gaming. Also, 3 of the past 4 BioWare games were pushed out for release within 40 days of the end of Electronic Arts' financial year. Anthem was released on February 22nd, Andromeda was released on March 21st, Mass Effect 3 was released on March 6th, and the Electronic Arts financial year ends at the end of March 31st. I'm sure the boost in sales from each of those releases helped Electronic Arts' fiscal year look as good as possible for the stockholders, but Anthem and Andromeda had serious bug issues, and Mass Effect 3 came without a post-ending resolution. Each one of these led to serious backlash and reduced interest in the next title. Ultimately, Andromeda and Anthem made a lot less money than they could have. Allowing BioWare more time to finish these projects likely would have solved that. Of course, extended development time and delaying release dates costs more and delays the profit. But I don't think this next Mass Effect game is in a position to survive another rush to market. It's a big ask, but I don't see this game being successful without that corporate financial support and backing. And that's that. I tried to keep this video to things I think the game absolutely needs, and it's still long. This game is going to be a very tough assignment. It is doable, but this is going to be very tough. But I'm sure I glossed over something you think the next Mass Effect game needs, so don't hesitate to put your suggestion in the comments section. And if you like this video, toss it a like, and send a link of it to Electronic Arts and or BioWare. I'm sure they'll love it.
Having trouble working between your interruptions and Edie's insistence that insane experiments endanger entire crew. Hard to concentrate, affecting morale.
I should have more Mass Effect videos coming up, but for now...
I should go.
Help! Hooray! Need help! Come help me! Need help! Help! Hooray! This way! Come help me!